Was the flood myth found in the biblical text of Genesis stolen from older Mesopotamian flood mythologies? In this video, we're going to explore that question by comparing and contrasting the flood account within the biblical text to three flood myths from the ancient Near East. Those are the Eridu Genesis, Atrahasis, and the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the goal of this video is to provide a broad overview, so there's going to be plenty of details that we cannot cover. However, I will be doing future videos on each one of those accounts and providing more details there. Now, one final thing to note before jumping in is that there is plenty of discussion and disagreement regarding the interpretation of these accounts. And so I've done my best to gather the best possible scholarly material on all these accounts and present it to you in an unbiased manner. So that being said, let's dive right in. Now, the first thing that we actually need to do is talk about the dating of these documents, which is unfortunately one of the most complex aspects of comparing these documents. And there's also a lot of opinions out there on when and how these should be dated. However, I'm going to condense this down, make it very easy to understand. Please understand, though, there is disagreement, and we're going to start from order in which they were first written. So we'll start with the Eridu Genesis. This is the earliest Sumerian creation myth, but it doesn't include a flood account, and this is dated to the 22nd century BCE. Now, the best preserved copy of the Eridu Genesis was written in Sumerian cuneiform on a single tablet in 6 columns. And unfortunately, only the lower third remains. And due to this fragmentary nature of the Eridu Genesis and the flood account within it, it makes it difficult to determine the similarities between it and the flood account of Genesis chapter 6 through 9. However, the text does parallel with flood accounts in the Atrahasis Epic and the Epic of Gilgamesh, and likely shares literary relationship with those documents, which provides a lot of assistance when comparing the text. Next is the Atrahasis Epic. It is an early Akkadian poem dated to the 18th century BCE. And the most complete copies of this epic, and probably the oldest as well, are those copied by the scribe Epic. And transparently, I don't know that I'm pronouncing the name right. The scribe was formerly believed to be named Nuri. However, as Stephanie Daly notes, this was actually a mistranslation. And the critical texts of the Atrahasis Epic are based on Epic's 3 tablets. And then we have Gilgamesh. This is probably the most well-known, as it is an Akkadian poem dating to the 18th century BCE. Now, I have an asterisk by this because there are actually several different versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh. There is the Old Babylonian version dating to the 2nd millennium BCE, and then there's the Standard Babylonian version. This is from the 10th to 13th century BCE, and this is actually the version that I used for the analysis. And you might think, why didn't you use the Old Babylonian version? And that's because the Old Babylonian version is thought to actually not have included the flood account within it. And the flood account that shows up in the Standard Babylonian version was actually influenced by the flood account from the Atrahasis Epic. And if you read both those epics side by side, you will see a clear relationship. And finally, we have the biblical text. And there's going to be a vast number of opinions on the authorship of this. However, within the scholarly circles, the most consensus view you're going to find is this view of the combined sources of the J and P source. That is the Yahweh source and the priestly source. And the Yahweh source goes back to the 10th century BCE, really about a span of potentially about 200 years. And then the priestly source would be the 6th century BC. What ended up happening is that there were 2 flood accounts, one from the J source, one from the P source, and then an editor or redactor at a later point in time actually merged and combined these together. And you can see instances where the editor or redactor inserted text to make it flow. And the way that the redactor has ordered it, it actually forms a wonderful chiasm. And depending on the scholar that you are reading, there will be a different number of points to that chiasm. And now that we've tackled the dating, let's move on to the similarities within these accounts. And we'll begin the similarities with the divine origin of the flood stories. Now, in terms of the biblical text, God observes human wickedness and decides to send a flood. In Eridu, it implies similar divine displeasure, but lacks details within the narrative. In Atrahasis, you have overpopulation, and the god Enlil is annoyed by humankind's noise and decides to send a flood. And then in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods are disturbed by human noise and population. So we can see in all 4 of these instances, it is the divine beings that decide to bring about the flood on humanity. Next, we have the heroic figure of each tale. And within the biblical text, this is Noah, who is described as a righteous man. We get that in Genesis 6:9. In Eridu, it is a man known as Zeusudra, who is a priest king and who is favored by the gods. In Atrahasis, we have a man named Atrahasis. That's where the epic gets its name. And he is the flood hero who receives divine instruction. The text actually states that his ear was open to his god Enki. And he is actually saved from 3 attempts to essentially wipe out humanity. And then in Gilgamesh, we have a man named Utnapishtim, who is granted immortality and is the sole survivor of the flood. Now, what's important to note about this is that in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh is the hero. Utnapishtim is simply someone that Gilgamesh hears about or knows about to have survived a flood from a long time ago. And while Gilgamesh is on his quest for immortality, he seeks out Utnapishtim because Utnapishtim is immortal because of his survival from the flood. Now, there's also the command to build a vessel. And within 3 of these 4 accounts, the heroes receive divine instructions to construct a vessel, although the details differ slightly. But they are related, and we'll get into more of the differences later. But within the biblical text, it provides detailed instructions to build an ark, and this is Genesis 6, 14 through 16. In Eridu, the text is missing due to the damage of the tablet. And in Atrahasis, the hero is directed to build a boat from his house. And very similar within Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim is instructed to dismantle his house and to build a boat. And another common element is the use of pitch for these vessels. Within the biblical text, Noah's Ark is coated with pitch. That's Genesis 6:14. In Eridu, again, the text is missing due to the damage of the tablet. In Atrahasis, the boat is similarly described as being watertight, and in Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim's boat is also built with pitch. The preservation of life is also emphasized in most of these narratives. Within the biblical text, Noah brings pairs of each animal onto the ark, and it's Genesis 6, 19 through 20. And then Noah does, in fact, bring 7 pairs of the clean types of animals on the ark as well. This has long been noted by scholars as being a priestly thing that he does. Within Eridu, again, the instructions are missing because of the damage of the tablet, although animals are available for sacrifice post-flood, which had to have meant that they were brought on board. And given the relationship that Eridu shares with Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, and that in both of those accounts, the heroes are instructed to save various types of animals or gather animals, it is likely that the missing text within Eridu Genesis does include the instructions to gather animals and bring them on board the vessel. There's also the use of birds. Now, I have this here under the similarities, and you can see that both Eridu and Atrahasis actually lack this detail. However, there's such a strong similarity and correlation between the birds within the biblical text and in Gilgamesh, it's worth mentioning here. And within the biblical text, Noah sends out a raven and a dove to find land. That's Genesis 8, 6 through 12. And then in Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim releases a dove, a swallow, and a raven for the same purpose. You can see that the difference there is the swallow, but what scholars have recognized is the similarity between the dove and the raven. Now, if you're interested in digging in further on this, there is a great paper by scholar James Bijon. It is called Toward a Theology of the Jubilee, and it actually speaks of specifically the raven and the dove, and it links this to the Day of Atonement within the biblical text. So if you're interested in that, I'd highly recommend this. He actually links this entire flood narrative to the Day of Atonement within Israelite religion. And it will also help this entire flood narrative make a lot more sense in reading his work. Now, perhaps one of the most important similarities in terms of ancient Near Eastern culture within all of these accounts is the element of sacrifice. Within the biblical text, Noah makes a sacrifice on an altar after the flood. That's in Genesis 8, 20 through 21. Eridu implies offerings, but lacks explicit references due to the fragmentary text. In Atrahasis, the hero emerges and sacrifices to appease the gods. And in Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim offers a sacrifice to the gods. And in terms of sacrifice, this is actually where we see a common element overall, but the specific details of each are quite different. Now, one big similarity is this idea of smelling the sacrifice and that smell being pleasing to God or the gods in the accounts. But where the accounts really differ is, for instance, in Atrahasis, where the gods are actually very hungry and very thirsty because there's been no human beings to offer them food and drink from sacrifice. And so when Atrahasis offers this, the text actually describes the gods gathering around the sacrifice like flies. And then we also have the assurance from the deity. All of these accounts conclude with divine assurances. Within the biblical text, God promises never to destroy the earth by flood again. This is where we get the very familiar God's rainbow in the sky. In Eridu, similar assurances are implied, though unclear. In Atrahasis, Nintu, who is one of the gods of the pantheon, she has a fly necklace. And scholar Ann Kilmore has actually suggested that the wings of the flies on this particular necklace would offer a visual reminiscent of the rainbow in Genesis. And fly necklaces were something that were familiar within the ancient Near Eastern culture. And then in Gilgamesh, the gods assure Utnapishtim of his immortality, but not necessarily the earth's safety. So while the assurance from a deity is a common theme, there are some differences. And in particular, two of these are that in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the god Enlil is furious that there were survivors of the flood. And then in Atrahasis, the text actually concludes with 3 punishments on humanity to essentially control the overpopulation issue that they faced initially. Now, another difference is the duration of the flood within each of these accounts. You'll actually notice that within Eridu, Atrahasis, and Gilgamesh, they're actually quite similar. You essentially have the flood lasting for 1 week, where Eridu and Atrahasis are identical. The only difference in Gilgamesh is that instead of 7 days and 7 nights, you have 6 days and 7 nights. But pretty much everybody's just going to say it's right at a week. Whereas within the biblical text, the time frame is actually written as a chiasm. It opens up, you have 2 periods of 7 days, followed by a period of 40 days, then 150 days, and then it all reverses back on itself. So you get another 150, another 40, and then another 2 periods of 7 days. And essentially there's 2 schools of thoughts on this. One is that the author is essentially letting you know that the flood lasted for 1 year. The other school of thought is that it was 1 year and 10 days. And that 1 year and 10 days is significant when you consider the Day of Atonement that was mentioned earlier and when the Day of Atonement was celebrated in terms of the Israelite calendar. And similar to the duration of the flood, we have the number of deities within each account. Now, again, this is going to be where Eridu, Atrahasis, and Gilgamesh are essentially identical, because in each of these accounts, there's multiple gods. They have specific roles, so there's an emphasis on the pantheon, whereas the biblical text is characterized by a singular monotheistic god. And actually, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the text states that even the gods were afraid of the flood weapon. And so what we see in these accounts outside of the biblical text is that the gods actually cannot agree amongst themselves on what should be done regarding humanity, and even in terms of the details of the flood. And they are also not in full control, where in the biblical text, it is God acting alone who is also in control. And sticking with the themes of numbers, we'll talk about the number of survivors. These vary within each text. Within the biblical text, there's 8 total survivors. This would be Noah and his family. In Eridu, there's Ziusudra and possibly his family, although the details are unclear. In Atrahasis, it typically just focuses on the hero. There's not really mention of anybody else. However, his family was on board with him, and there was also a group of people that were in his house when he transformed it into a boat. So there is some indication there that all of these people would have survived too. It's just not clearly outlined within the text. And within Gilgamesh, you have Utnapishtim and his wife are the only survivors. And so we can see here that with a number of survivors, this actually might imply differences within cultural values on community. And we talked earlier about how one of the similarities was to construct a vessel, and now we'll talk about how the vessel specifications were different within each account. So within the biblical text, it provides specific dimensions of the ark, and you can find that in Genesis 6, 15 through 16. In Eridu, the information is once again missing. In Atrahasis, the details are minimal, though it roughly describes a round vessel that's about 230 feet in diameter with 20-foot walls. And then in Gilgamesh, it describes a cube-shaped ark and uses the language that the length and the width need to be in harmony. Now, in terms of the survival outcome of each account, there are stark differences here, and these different outcomes could suggest varying understandings within each culture of divine-human relationships. Within the biblical text, you have God establishing a covenant. In Eridu, you have Ziusudra, who was granted life like a god's and who lived among the gods after this flood event. Within Atrahasis, the gods eventually agree to control the human population, but they do this through means of instituting 3 punishments. This was regarding the ability to have children, infant mortality, as well as celibacy. And then in Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim and his wife receive immortality, and this emphasizes personal reward for their survival. And there's also major differences within the moral implications from each text. Within the biblical account, it offers strong moral teachings about righteousness, whereas in Eridu, there's less focus on morality, but this is likely due to the fragmentary nature of the text. And then in Atrahasis, it emphasizes the importance of following divine wisdom. So right there, that's fairly similar to what we see in the biblical account. But in Gilgamesh, the moral lessons are implied, but they're slightly obscured. And this is because it's really more about Gilgamesh's personal quest for immortality rather than Utnapishtim. Although Utnapishtim does have quite the conversation with Gilgamesh, essentially asking him why he's on this quest for immortality, that it's essentially useless to do so, that he's abandoned being the king of his city to go on this quest, that all of his clothes are ragged and tattered. And so again, while there are some similarities, we see Genesis standing out in terms of its consistent moral clarity. Now, another major difference to note, although it doesn't pertain to the details within the story, is the preservation of the documents. And when we compare the biblical text to Eridu, Genesis, Atrahasis, as well as the Epic of Gilgamesh, what we actually have in terms of the latter 3, the preservation of these documents is on fragmented clay tablets with unfilled gaps. And actually, all of these documents were lost to history for a large amount of time. For instance, Eridu Genesis was not discovered until 1893. And although later versions of the flood episode from Atrahasis had been known for a long time, the structure of the epic and therefore the context of the story was not understood until fragments were discovered during the 19th century and a more complete version that was actually found in 1965. And the Epic of Gilgamesh was discovered in 1848. However, there was a man named George Smith who actually presented fragments of the flood story from the Epic of Gilgamesh in a paper that he gave in 1872. But when we contrast that to the biblical text, we have the biblical text largely preserved through scroll technology. And yes, there's a lot of fragments and incomplete versions of the biblical text. However, the biblical text, since it has been compiled together, has gone unbroken generation to generation. There has not been a time in history since its writing where the biblical text was simply lost to known existence. And so again, this doesn't pertain to the actual details within the story, but this is something that is important to recognize from a historical perspective. And now that we've broadly discussed the similarities and differences between these 4 flood myths, we need to return to the question of, was the biblical flood myth stolen from any one of these other three ancient Near Eastern flood myths? Now, there's multiple viewpoints and suggestions as to the relationship between these stories. And really, we can break these down into three broad categories. And believe it or not, one of these is that the Mesopotamian literature actually borrowed from Genesis. Now, I'm not going to spend any time on this at all. This is incredibly unlikely. And in terms of scholarship, there is little to no scholarship that supports this, with the exception of maybe a handful of people. There's also the thought that the biblical account emerged independently. There's a scholar by the name of Kenneth Matthews who states in his commentary that is titled Genesis 1 through 11:26, it is now agreed that the Hebrew account was independent and the versions testify to a widely remembered corpus of events. So he's essentially making the argument here that the biblical account actually emerged independently of these other accounts. And then there's obviously the viewpoint that has been the focus of this video, and that is that the authors of the Genesis flood myth stole from the Mesopotamian literature and accounts that we have looked at within this video. Now, there's a very good paper that was written by, I believe it's Dr. Amanda Norsker, and it's titled Genesis 6, 5 through 11 and 17, a rewritten Babylonian flood myth. And I'd recommend giving it a read. But she has two quotes that present this viewpoint. She said, this is done, she's talking about this paper, this is done to present some of the clearest evidence of the Genesis account being a rewriting of the Babylonian flood myths based on a familiarity with a written version of the Gilgamesh flood story. And then this is what she states in the conclusion. Thus, there is evidence of a development from Atrahasis to Gilgamesh to Genesis. However, there is going to be scholarship that pushes back against this stronger language that seems to suggest that the biblical authors stole or simply just repurposed material that they themselves had no prior knowledge of. And there's a quote from Edward Bridge in his entry in the Lexham Bible Dictionary in the Atrahasis Epic that I believe sums up the relationship pretty well. Now, he is speaking specifically about the biblical text compared to the Atrahasis Epic, although I think the quote works well when we look at all four of these myths in comparison. And this is what it states. The flood narrative in the Atrahasis Epic is characterized more by its differences than similarities to the account in Genesis 6 through 9. But a lot of these similarities involve things such as divine origins, that the stories have a central flood myth hero, or that pitch was used to make the ship watertight. But when we look at perhaps some of the biggest differences, we see some very sharp contrast within the biblical account compared to Eridu, Atrahasis, and Gilgamesh. And two of these major differences are that within the biblical text, God is in complete control of the flood. Whereas in Eridu, Atrahasis, and Gilgamesh, the gods actually cannot agree in terms of the flood, and they do not have full control. There's actually a line from both Atrahasis and Gilgamesh that states that the gods were afraid of the, quote, flood weapon. And then in terms of judgment, within the biblical text, the flood is brought about as a judgment against the violence and corruption of humanity on the earth. Whereas in Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, the judgment is because of overpopulation and that humanity is too noisy and disturbing the gods' sleep. And a quote that does a really good job of stating this is taken from Dr. Longman and Dr. Waltman's book, The Locked World of the Flood. And they state this: the similarities in the telling of the flood story between the Eridu Genesis, Atrahasis, Gilgamesh Tablet 11, and the biblical account may be explained not by the necessarily literary borrowing, but by the fact that this story has been passed down from generation to generation by those who float on the same cultural river. And then they actually go on to say, I just have this included because I think it's an interesting thought to think about, that the literary theological interpretation of the event is inspired, not the event itself. And then there's this quote taken from the textbook, A Survey of the Old Testament, and it says, many who have done thorough linguistic and literary analysis conclude that literary dependence cannot be demonstrated. Here, as in most of the parallels in the primeval history, it is considered more likely that Mesopotamian and biblical traditions are based on a common source. More likely, the two literary traditions simply imply that common traditions circulated throughout the ancient world. So in terms of dependence, it can rather be said that the biblical authors were well aware of these other accounts and were clearly writing a polemic against these accounts in many instances. And this should come as no surprise because there's actually been instances where the old Babylonian versions of the Enuma Elish have been found side by side with the Assyrian versions. And the name of the Babylonian gods were changed to the name of the Assyrian gods. So this should give us clear indication that within the ancient world, the cultures were familiar with the rivaling religious myths that surrounded them. And in terms of this common source language, there's going to be a lot of people that actually link this common source back to common knowledge of a real event from the past. All right, everyone, I hope this video was informative and gave you a better understanding of these four flood myths and their relationship to one another. But now it's your turn. I want to hear what you have to say. So let me know in the comments below and make sure you check back in for future videos where I'll be going more in depth on each one of these accounts. But for now, why don't you check out this video that YouTube seems to think that you'll like, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks so much.